Hello everyone, and welcome to our review of week 3, really our chapter covering most of Egypt. Now, let's get moving on here. There we go. Looking at PowerPoint question number 1, what differences do you notice between Egypt and Mesopotamian culture, and to what degree do you think the geography of both locations account for these differences? And really, a comparison between Egypt and Mesopotamia is a great case study in observing the link between geography and culture. Remember, one of the main elements of culture is really how people interact with their environment, but this is always a two-way street. Human culture helps determine how people view, experience, and utilize their environment, while the environment is really also continually helping to dictate how cultures form. So it works kind of back and forth. Many people brought up in their answers this week our primary source activity and how that factored into this, and how the two rivers of the two lands kind of impacted the religious beliefs and how that was observed in the documents. And that's a really good example. But also a lot of people brought up other interesting ways that they saw the environment impacting Mesopotamian and Egyptian culture. For example, the clay that we used for writing or creating mud bricks for ziggurats was so important to Mesopotamia, and really allowed them to create the cities and their civilizations. And a lot of that was based upon, of course, their natural environment. And really the dry conditions in Egypt that were necessary for mummification. The stones, a lot of people brought up the limestone that was necessary for building, constructing these great pyramids. As well as just the idea that this geographic conditions within Egypt really helped to lead to a more unified state system, are just some of the many examples that people brought up to this question. I thought overall the class did a very good job. Moving on to question number 2, how does the practice of mummification relate to Egyptian religion and the idea of Ma'at? Really the idea of kind of a stable, repeatable cycle is this process that has clear parallels between Ma'at and mummification, and the role that mummification plays within the larger Egyptian religion. Mummification was really an attempt to preserve the body after death, as Ma'at was an attempt to really preserve the order of the world. So as long as the pharaoh was able to protect Ma'at when he lived, mummification would then allow him to continue to protect Ma'at in death, as he took on the new role of Osiris. So a lot of people did a very good job pointing out kind of the cyclical nature of both the mummification process within the religious frame, as well as then the idea of maintaining this idea of order, stability, and balance. So lots of very good answers to question 2 here. Moving on to question number 3. How did the Egyptian practices of monument building and mummification ultimately lead to advances in mathematics and medicine? And once here, this question number 3 has a direct tie-in to question number 1, if you notice a lot of these parallels. Both mummification and monument construction were really made possible by the Egyptian environment, not to mention the relative kind of stability and strong insulated political structure that made possible by the geography, which kind of led Egypt to be able to form these very kind of large centralized government systems. So really these cultural aspects were all directly influenced to one degree or another by the environment, and led to the knowledge such as mathematics and medicine. This knowledge would also in turn impact and influence Egyptian culture itself. For example, think of Imhotep, becoming the god of medicine, which then once more kind of gets factored into and brought into kind of the religious structure, which then also becomes kind of ingrained in the cultural system. So in this way, you can really kind of see that the process of environmental and cultural influences and impact is also kind of in some ways cyclical, where one impacts another, and then the other one kind of comes around to impact the environment more to a larger degree. So something to keep in mind there. So what were the differences that you noticed in Egypt between the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms? Remember, the Old Kingdom was really typified by the large pyramids. The biggest pyramids were built in the Old Kingdom and were really kind of typical of the very strong pharaoh system during this time period. The pharaoh had really a lot of power. He was considered the living god, and that pretty much everyone was underneath him, and really kind of the construction of the Great Pyramids, and that people were willing to take so much time to kind of donate to build the pyramids and to serve kind of the state and to serve the pharaoh in this process is something pretty remarkable, and something that's not really kind of replicated in the future ages within Egypt. After kind of the decline of the Old Kingdom and through the first intermediate period and restructuring in the Middle Kingdom, you certainly see many more people beginning to kind of take share of power within Egypt. The priesthood begins to become more powerful as Ra begins to be exalted as sort of the main deity, and having some separation there between kind of the pharaoh being the only one main kind of god and having Ra being also kind of a very powerful religious figure. Also kind of the democratization of the afterlife, the fact that more people were now able to become mummified, and that it wasn't only restricted for royalty. And of course, then some changes heading into the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom, you certainly see a very strong centralized state once again, but you see much smaller tombs and burial places, trying to make sure that these tombs are now going to stay hidden, as most of the tombs previous to this had been raided to some degree or another. And also the fact that Egypt is becoming much more interested in branching out, playing a part in the larger Middle East, conquering other foreign nations, engaging in diplomacy, and really kind of becoming the most strongest power in a much larger kind of Near East political system. All sorts of typify the new kingdoms. Where a lot of people ran into some problems in this question is that they look at kind of Old, Middle, and New Kingdom and just assume that, for example, pyramids had been really small in the Old Kingdom and got bigger as time went on, which I think plays a lot more into kind of our modern conceptualization of what progress is. Obviously, it makes sense to have small monuments earlier on and things get bigger and bigger. That's just ultimately not the way that it works sometimes in history. And the idea of the pyramids here is a really good example of that the largest pyramids were actually built and designed during the Old Kingdom. By the New Kingdom, certainly it was certainly as powerful, but just the way that power was being displayed was in larger armies, larger palaces, perhaps larger temples, but not necessarily in the construction of real large pyramids. Moving on to question number 5, why do you think Egypt was able to maintain itself as such a strong civilization and culture for such a long period of time? I think it's really important to remember here that we're kind of roughly speaking of a period between around 2600 BCE and 1000 BCE, which is still approximately 1600 years of history. And just think of all the ways that our world has changed in the past 1600 years. It really gives you some perspective of just how impressive Egypt was at remaining relatively holistic as a cultural group for as long as they did. Just as a comparison, America has been a country now and has only been in existence for about 240 years by comparison, which I think really kind of lets you know that, I mean, think about the United States existing for about, what would that be? Well, over 10 times longer than it already has, and then you're getting to the idea of how long Egypt was able to maintain itself in a stable state system. Even though there were disruptions in there, the fact that the people in the New Kingdom could still trace kind of their lineage and their tie and their cultural heritage right back to the old system really shows you how effective they were. Egypt's stable environment really was created by this routine flooding of the Nile and its geographic isolation. Really both need to be taken into account. Of almost all of these are of equal importance. However, the Egyptian society used these stable elements to form the idea of Ma'at. And I think a lot of people brought this up in their answer, that Ma'at is really the key here. The fact that the natural environment got transferred into a very stable political and human environment, and that as long as people were trying to uphold and use the ideas of stability that Ma'at provided, it ultimately ended up making the Egyptian culture very, very successful. So once you kind of had a human society which was bent upon continuing the system of stability and order that they saw kind of naturally within nature, it greatly enhanced their long-term survivability. You can really kind of make a comparison between Egypt and the rest of the Near East, where pretty much the ancient Near East was typified by kind of a revolving door of kingdoms and empires, just one coming after another, and nothing that nearly reached kind of the same continuity that Egypt was able to form. Eventually, a new empire will rise up in the Near East area, the Persian Empire, which had various alterations but was going to maintain itself for a very long period of time too. Essentially, they kind of take over as being the main kind of dominant political and cultural force within the ancient Near East moving forward, but we're going to be talking about that in future lessons. It's also, you can really kind of compare kind of this very similar cultural elements that develop in China, which we'll be covering next week, and see kind of how this emphasis on stability and order helped China create kind of one of the world's longest and most successful empires, one of the most profitable empires in civilization's history. And that there's a lot of comparisons you can draw between how Egypt did it and how China was able to do it, as far as finding practices and philosophies which really supported order, balance, and stability, and the natural geographic environment which helped back that up by giving them a certain amount of insulation from kind of competing outside groups. So some things to keep in mind for future lectures. All right, from there then, we are going to go ahead and hop on over to our document exercise. I know these are a little bit difficult at this point in time, kind of reading the language, trying to figure out exactly what they're saying, but I thought overall everyone did a pretty good job of this. So when we go through, take a look at the two documents and discuss some of the differences that you noticed between the Egyptians and how the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians perceived their natural environment, particularly the rivers. A lot of people use this very first quote out of the document on the Nile to kind of show the perspective the Egyptians had of the river. Hail thee, O Nile, who manifests thyself over this land and comes to give life to Egypt. Yeah, I think very simple, straight to the point. A lot of people point out that they thought that the Egyptians were worshiping the Nile almost like they would worship a god itself, which is, I would say, very, very true. Moving down to our next example here, you kind of see, you create the grain, you bring forth the barley, assuring perpetuity of the temples. If you cease your toil and your work, then all that exists is in anguish. So once more showing all the kind of the benefits of what the river allows, and stating right off the bat that if you take that away, the human societies are not going to be doing great. And certainly the Egyptians recognized where all their prosperity was coming from. Another line here that some people used: he shines when he issues forth from the darkness to cause his flocks to prosper. It is his force that gives existence to all things. Once more, a great way to put it, showing the importance of the river. So pretty much all the depictions that you see of the river here in the Egyptian document are all very positive, right? It's life-giving, very beneficial to humans, making all things possible. And you can compare that then to really the kind of depictions that we have of water and flooding and the river system within the Mesopotamian document, within the Epic of Gilgamesh. The first line that some people point out was, in the morning, cakes darkness, and kind of darkness caking the sky. In the evening, a rain of wheat, real heaviness, shower down. So pretty much the land becomes really dark. It begins raining incredibly heavy. And I saw the shape of the storm. The storm was terrifying to see. So sort of showing how, remember how a lot of these floods got started was storm systems sweeping over the plains into the mountains. There in the mountains, the rain would kind of create this flood system, which would then swash down. So kind of showing how seeing this process occur is pretty interesting here. And that's backed up in our next passage here. Like the battle force of the destructive Kashahu weapon passed over the people, kind of the flood weapon. No man could see his fellow, nor could he be distinguished from the sky. Even the gods were afraid of the flood weapon. How the flood kind of washed down, took everyone by surprise, and really kind of comparing the river here to a weapon that the gods are in fact using to punish humans. I don't believe it was the entire story was included in this version that I have in the document, but essentially the initial reason why the gods decide to punish humanity is because humans were making too much noise and the gods were having trouble to sleep, having trouble getting to sleep. So the head god decided to pretty much wipe out all humanity so they'd just be quiet with all their warfare and chattering and carrying on. So that there really, wasn't a real kind of strict moral reason why they were punishing the humans. It was more just because they were being inconvenient to the gods. And once more sort of shows this really clear idea of how the gods have this very kind of fickle relationship with humans and just kind of turn on them on a whim Very similar to how you see the storm come up very rapidly, right? And this anger is suddenly unleashed on the people without warning. The wind blew, the flood and tempest overwhelmed the land. When the seventh day arrived of the tempest, the flood and onslaught, which had struggled like women in labor, blew themselves out. So kind of showing this entire process of how the wind blew, the flood came up and rose up, and how all this then eventually blew itself over. So certainly showing a much more hectic and a much more kind of aggressive version of the river, and being used as a weapon against the people, not being the same sort of sustainer of life that you see in the Egyptian document. So how, for question number 2 then, does this impact Egyptian and Mesopotamian culture, and specifically how they perceive their gods? So very similar to how they perceive the rivers, the Egyptians here are portraying their gods in a very important and kind of beneficial way. Watering the orchards created by Re, or Ra, the sun god, to create all the cattle to live, you give the earth to drink, inexhaustible one. So saying that Re had this creating the orchards, creating positive and beneficial things. The next slide down here, if the gods suffer in heaven, then the faces of men waste away. So this link between how the gods are important, and how when the gods suffer, humanity suffers as well. Moving down, the children Sobek and the sons of Nineth, the cycle of the gods which dwells in him and are prosperous. Once more kind of showing this idea of how much the cyclical nature of the gods is important to the Egyptians, and how that's tied into the cyclical nature of the rivers themselves. And finally down here, men exalt him like the cycle of the gods. Once more this idea of the cycle. They dread him who creates the heat, pretty much the sun god Ra, even though he, Ra, has made his son Osiris the universal master, in order to give prosperity to Egypt. Come and prosper, O Nile, come and prosper. So once more showing a much more kind of positive view of the gods themselves. And even though Re, the sun god, could have a kind of harsh connotation to him, and that people could dread kind of the heat that was coming down, certainly the Nile River made all of that beneficial still, and kind of made it so that everyone could still prosper. Comparing that then to depictions of the gods. Right here, you kind of see the gods playing a direct role in this quote as far as bringing the storm, and bringing the clouds, and bringing the flood that ultimately ends up having these kind of devastating consequences, which you have been talking about. A black cloud came up from the base of the sky. Adad kept rumbling inside it. Kind of the thunder, right? This thunder god. Shalet and Hanish were marching ahead. March as the chamberlains over mountain and country, so once more beginning in the mountains and rushing down into the countryside. Icaral pulled out the mooring poles, and Inerta marched on and made the weirs overflow. Pretty much the dams, things that were supposed to keep the water in check, were made to overflow and flood the nature. So pretty much saying right here, God by God, who is doing what in this process, and how they are making this flood come down to the people. Nope, I think I misplaced that one. There we go. And of course, after this flood is up, Enlil comes down and kind of sees what happened, and is ultimately furious that the flood did not actually kill all of humanity, kind of saying, what sort of life survived? No man should have lived through the destruction, saying he wanted to really kind of wipe out all humans, and was pretty dismayed here that one of them had managed to survive. Through the process of sacrifices, though, pretty much the gods are able to become appeased. Enlil is the one who is kind of the angry one, while Ea is the one who is trying to warn the humanity and benefit them, and pretty much talks Enlil into trying to find other ways to punish humans for the transgressions. Particularly because, remember, it mentioned earlier how the gods themselves were actually afraid of the flood, which I think was a kind of a very interesting thing to put in here. This idea that even though the flood was a weapon imposed by the gods, it kind of got out of hand and out of control, and they had to run back up to heaven before it would destroy them as well. But instead of punishing people with the flood, which was so devastating, saying here, instead of imposing the flood, let a lion come to diminish the people. Instead of imposing a flood, let a wolf come to diminish the people. Instead of imposing a flood, let famine be imposed to lessen the land. Instead of your imposing the flood, let Era rise up and savage the people, kind of these other angry people around the Mesopotamians. So really, just kind of trying to say that the flood was kind of viewed as such a devastating weapon, and trying to convince the gods themselves to find sort of these other ways to punish humanity. And it's kind of, sort of, it really gives a good viewpoint of the mentality of the Mesopotamians. Sort of right here, they're trying to pick their poison, right? Kind of saying we'd rather be eaten by lions and wolves, we'd rather succumb to famine, we'd rather have warfare with other people than actually have this flood let loose on us again. Sort of showing the mentality that they came through. But very different depiction of the gods within our second document here than what you saw in the exaltation of the Nile. So those are some of the main key points that you could have pointed out to make your arguments for the first few questions. The third question was very interesting. A lot of people took this in a lot of different directions. In kind of what ways the environment continue to affect civilizations today. Some people made very good connotations as far as, look at the weather and the climate in Michigan, what can be grown, how does that affect, the way that we make our lives here today, as opposed to people who live in Florida, as people who live in California and warmer climates, or people who live in Arizona and more of a drier climate, how that still has quite a bit of effect on local economies and how people are living their lives. Some people brought up the idea and the issue of global warming and saying that this environment still has a very big impact on our lives. Potentially, this could be coming much more to the forefront of people's kind of awareness of the environment and the impact that it has on civilizations, particularly if some of these very negative consequences that people are speculating about actually ultimately end up coming to fruition. And some people kind of look specifically at the Nile River from them until now, just kind of showing the how some of the issues are still kind of around the river today, pollution and things like that, and how people are still, though, kind of dependent and reliant upon a lot of these same environmental resources that we were very early on in the process of kind of the development of these large stratified states. We're still reliant upon them in very much kind of the same ways today. So that's the end of our week 3 review. Good job, everyone, and I'm looking forward to reading everything going into week 3, or week 4. All right, thank you very much, and have a great rest of the week.